Welcome to our. It feels like the final webinar of the season or the series or whatever you call it. It's been a long time coming to get here. It's at least a good 12, 15 months of the process itself, with the first consultation paper on the Fair Funding Review 2.0, last December 24, so just over 12 months. But the whole process and what we've been looking forward to really it's been almost 10 years in the making. So it really does feel like a bit of a full stop on this whole process. The final settlement, with I think probably the biggest change in local government funding in a generation. And the last couple of weeks have been fairly tense as we tried to work out exactly what they are going to do in the final settlement. More change in the final settlement than I think I've ever known. For different reasons, policy reasons, as well as for corrections and technical reasons. So a more involved final settlement than we're used to be honest. So there is more to go through here. We'll start with some context about the timing and what the movements are, and then work through each of the key issues that have been changed in the final settlement and some things that haven't changed. We'll look at our model and the changes, the updates we'll make. That model will be out imminently, and then Dan will take over and do more in-depth insight into what's in the final settlement, what it means for different types of authority. So in terms of timescale and process, I think this latest phase really started with the policy statement on the 20th of November, the provisional settlement on the 17th of December, and then the 4-week consultation with the response to that consultation, and the final settlement on Monday. The debate is today, so we'll cover that and see what's in there. But it is late. It's the latest final settlement in recent years, and casting back, I think I could only find one that was later over the last 15 years. That was on the 20th of February 2016, wouldn't it, if it's for that particular settlement. So it is later than the recent pattern, which has tended to be in the week before. And I think this pattern of very late settlements has now become really rather entrenched, and lots of downsides to that. It makes it very difficult to set budget for you guys with any certainty. I mean, you have to work on the basis that there is no change or no reduction between provisional and final. As a result, that leaves MHCLG with effectively no room for change except putting increases through between the provisional and the final. Does anyone remember the Hudson report? I think that was following an error I think probably it was in 2017-18 actually, to do with the business rate system. The recommendation in that report was that the settlements were happening too late. The provisional should be in the end of November and the final in the early part of January, for this very reason, that it's too late to really help authorities plan, and it's too late to make any changes between provisional and final. So, but government doesn't seem to be able to deliver against what the Hudson report recommended. In terms of the overall changing core spending power over the next 3 years, not that much change at class level compared to the provisional settlement. The overall core spending power increase is marginally higher, 15.5% rather than 15.3% over the next 3 years, but a similar shape. Above average increases for Outer London Mets unitaries, below average for counties, county unitaries. So that's similar sorts of shape. Shire districts and Inner London continue to have by far the lowest increases in core spending power. Improved outcomes for standalone fire authorities, especially for combined fire authorities. So more in the settlement for fire authorities. In terms of the change, again, things haven't moved hugely compared to the provisional settlement, but you do see there in London, the increase is higher from 2.1 to 4.8. That's really because of the City of London now being included properly in the figures. They weren't previously in the provisional. Shire districts increasing from 3.3% to 4.8%, but that's a slight bit. It's not trickery, but it's a problem with the change in the baseline. So the increase in core spending power looks higher because the 2025-26 baseline is lower. So it's all to do with the way that the business rate pooling gains have been rolled in, gives districts a lower baseline, but the target in year 3 is the same. So it just looks like the average increase for shire districts is slightly higher. Converse is the case for shire counties. It looks like counties increase is slightly lower, and that's just because the baseline's higher with the same target level of funding in year 3. So It's just the way the baseline works, but it's slightly confusing and slightly counterintuitive. For Met authorities, the increase goes up slightly from 19.1 to 19.8%. That's because of the recovery grant uplift, which also benefits some unitary authorities as well. And then combined fire authorities, and to a lesser extent, metropolitan fire authorities, an increase, quite substantial increase there for combined fire authorities. That's largely because of the funding floor increase, which we'll cover later. Outer London, again, still the biggest increase in core spending power of any class of authority, but it's slightly lower than it was. And I think that, again, that might be a slight impact of the way that the baseline's been adjusted. Quite a few outer London boroughs were the top up authorities in pools, so they gained slightly from the way that the baselines have been set. But it looks like that in terms of the way that we measure core spending power from the 25-26 baseline, it looks like their increase is slightly lower. Same thing is happening with shire counties. But I mean that the real proof of where the money has been going, and the difference between provisional and final, is where the cash is. And you can see here that the increases are in all the different classes of authority apart from shire districts. So the increase in London boroughs is slightly skewed by the fact that it includes the City of London. But you can see there that the shire districts is reduced quite significantly, because the way that the baselines have been changed. The baselines are lower, so there's less cash in the system for shire districts. And the opposite is the case for shire counties, an increase for shire counties because the baseline's higher. There's more money in the system for shire counties. And I think that accounts really for that big switch between shire districts and shire counties. For metropolitan districts, the increase is largely to do with the recovery grant uplift, and as I said, for unitaries too. For others, combined fire authorities, principally because of the funding floor increase. But obviously there's more in there as well. So starting off now looking at the business rate issue. I mean, this is something that we were talking about following the policy statement and the provisional settlement. For us, it was fairly clear that the way they were rolling in the pooling gains was incorrect. They were allocating far too much of that gain to the tariff authority in the pool. And as I said, we thought it was unfair, and a better approach was easily achievable. And you can see there in terms of the business rate growth that was rolled in as a percentage of core spending power, 18.5% of that growth was going to shire districts. By far the largest share of any class of authority. It's just, I mean, we could see in terms of principle it was wrong, but also in terms of the way the modelling worked, it was clearly wrong. And I think, as we showed you in some of those webinars around that time, in late November or December, it created quite a dysfunctional system with very high baselines for district councils. For some high growth districts that were in pools, big uplifts in their funding that just weren't expected and were quite irrational, really. And it was less of an issue directly for county councils, but we could see that the gains that should have gone to counties and to top-up authorities more generally were going to the tariff authority members of pools. So the way that government had approached it was to say that they wanted to make sure the 25-26 baseline make the best estimate as far as practical of each authority's 25-26 income, a laudable aim in itself. But the problem was the way they actually sought to measure that level of income and taking into account the pooling gains of doing that. And the way they did it was, which now we know is wrong, was to allocate all the pooling gains to the tariff authority, to the levy paying authority, and giving nothing to the top-up authority, which is, as we knew at the time, but has now been confirmed by the department that was wrong. The department claimed it didn't have the information about individual pools to create a better formula. I'm not quite correct, actually. I think they do have the MOUs, but I wouldn't have advocated replicating the way each pool worked. I think there was scope, as we've seen now, for creating a nationwide formula for reasonably distributing the pooling gains. And as I said here, the error from my point of view was immediately clear following the policy statement. You could see it very clearly in our MTFP model, particularly for high growth shire districts and pools. And I know Lee over at LG Futures, he saw it straight away as well. So I'm not quite sure why it took the department quite so long to twig. So as we said, the gains now will be split between the top-up and the tariff pool members on a 50-50 basis. So for top authorities, the gains are then split based on the share of baseline funding level. For the tariff authorities, the gains split pro rata to their share of the levy gain within each pool, so effectively redistributing the gains from each pool between the pool members. And that reduces the business rate income for districts by 113 million, increases it for counties by 90. The other classes are slightly more mixed up because they're a mixture of top-up and tariff authorities, but broadly speaking, if you're a top-up authority, you've gained from this baseline change. If you're a tariff, you've lost from it if you are in a pool. I think there are arguments about that this could have, the methodology that they're now using to split the gains could have been done differently. I think there were different alternatives. We certainly had modelled different alternatives, but the outcomes in our different alternatives were similar to those that the government's using now. So I think it's a reasonable approach. Impacts on individual authorities, you can see very clearly here in cash terms what the movements are. The gains there, some of the bigger top-up authorities, Kent being the biggest county gainer, Leicester City being the biggest unitary gainer, and then some of the inland boroughs, outer London boroughs as well. You then see most fire authority, well, every fire authority who was in a pool would have gained as well. Some small losses for districts, every district's lost, but some of the biggest losses are from those very, very high growth district councils, North West Leicestershire, can't read all the legends there, South Cambridgeshire, Cherwell, Harborough, etc. So the places you'd expect to be losing, but then also some unitaries losing as well, Thurrock, Warrington, York, and also Leeds. I think pretty much the only Met who's lost from this change. So then the issue was, and we were aware of this in discussion over the last couple of weeks, that the government was adamant they were going to make that change, make that correction in the way that the gains were rolled into the baseline. But that would have meant some pretty significant cuts in funding for those authorities, especially for district councils, some really quite significant reductions in core spending power in the final settlement compared to the provisional. And we were very worried about that. And we weren't sure whether additional money would be found to support those authorities. In the end, it was this adjustment support grant. It's a new grant that makes sure that no authority gets less in terms of core spending power in the provisional settlement compared to the final in 26-27. It's a one-off grant, so it's just for 1 year, and I think it's because ministers just decided and realised that it just would not have been tenable to expect authorities to deal with less and potentially significantly less in the final settlement compared to the provisional. I think that's I did not understand how officials were even considering allowing authorities to have less money in the provisional than the final. It's in the final than the provisional settlement. Makes sense in the way it's calculated. It's calculated before homelessness grant and recovery grant uplift, although it only applies, I think pretty much to, well, it does apply to all types of authorities, principally being paid out to districts, but I think possibly something like Thurrock or Leeds would have got recovery grant, and it's calculated before those increases. It's led to a slight anomaly for a couple of district councils who do get the adjustment support grant, but for some reason which we don't know about yet, are getting less in homelessness grant. So their actual core spending power does reduce in the final settlement, but that's not because of the baseline adjustment. It's because there's something going on with the way that the homelessness grant's been distributed. We'll touch on that a bit later. As I said, the bulk of the payments go to shire districts, 89.6 million. There's a large payment to the City of London, as you can see there. That's why far right, the biggest loser from the way they've changed the pooling gain rolling is the City of London, and they get the largest adjustment support grant payment. The other big news, I think, was the recovery grant uplift. So it's kind of the third go they've had at doing something around recovery grant. The first was to, well, obviously it was introduced in 25-26 as a one-off grant. At the policy statement, there was a decision to extend it over 3 years, and then a further decision to tie the recovery grant to a recovery grant guarantee. So this is the third iteration of that, the way they're using recovery grant in the settlement, this time to target those who had the lower increases in the overall core spending power. So it's 440 million over 3 years, phased with 115 million year one, 150 million, and then 175 million. So I think I'd characterize it as a fairly complicated and a fairly arbitrary methodology. and it addresses the unexpected underfunding that I think has kind of emerged since the summer for some Met authorities and some unitaries, many of whom have got relatively high levels of deprivation. We're expecting a better outcome from the settlement and the fair funding process, yet we're receiving recovery grant, and yet found that in the provisional settlement, their outcomes just weren't particularly good and were less than they had been expecting. Those issues were excessive. We were seeing that in the summer, to be honest, and actually, I think we'd identified there could have been issues even before that in our modelling in 2024. So for us, it wasn't entirely a surprise. But those issues were exacerbated by the decision to use post-housing costs for 2025 IMD, which shifted funding even further away from some of those Mets and unitaries. So it's another kind of way of targeting that cohort of authorities who were doing least well, 42 authorities who will benefit from this over the next 3 years. In terms of the methodology, it is, as I said, it's fairly complicated. I think some of the thresholds and the caps are fairly arbitrary, but it clearly is a vehicle for getting funding to a particular cohort of authorities who obviously been putting pressure on ministers to make these changes. So it only goes to those authorities whose core spending power is going up by less than 17% over the 3 years. Payments are capped at that 17% threshold as well. A maximum of £10 million for those authorities with an increase of more than 14% in core spending power. The funding is then calculated on an iterative basis by applying the caps of 17% and £10 million maximum to redistribute those amounts over the period. In terms of the allocations, you can see here on the left some of the biggest increase, or the biggest increases, places like Sandwell, but then also places that we've been talking to, like Sunderland, like Rochdale, Wigan, for instance, South Tyneside as well, Blackpool, places that had it with relatively high levels or very high levels of deprivation, who had expected much better outcomes from the fair funding review and just weren't getting it for various reasons. So this very effectively puts money into those types of authority. You can see there in the middle of the pack, you've got those authorities who are capped at 10 million, some of them large cities like Newcastle and Liverpool, and others, mostly other Met authorities like Rotherham, Wakefield, Barnsley, and also places like Durham as well. And on the far right-hand side, some authorities getting relatively small amounts, Southend, North Lincolnshire, Darlington, Lambeth, Cumberland, for instance. And make this point, I think it's quite an important one. I know it's not very many authorities and it's a fairly small group, but for those shire districts with very high levels of deprivation, they really have been left out from this whole process. Ministers have made a very strong case that money needs to go to authorities with high levels of deprivation. It's fair enough as a policy outcome, but they've focused on upper tier authorities with high levels of deprivation. They've missed out some of those authorities, the districts like Great Yarmouth, Hyndburn, Pendle, etc., that have got high levels of deprivation and did very, 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 very badly between 2010 and 2020 from the cuts during austerity, and have continued to do badly since then as well. So I think they're really, I think they've really been left out by governments right the way across the last 15 years. Then in terms of funding floor allocations, clearly these are just recalculated. Apart from fire, the funding floor parameters have remained unchanged. The in London numbers are distorted by the City of London now being included, but you can see there for shire districts, they're getting less in terms of funding floor payments because it looks within the way that the core spending power numbers are calculated, it looks like they're losing less because their baseline's lower. So it looks like they need less funding floor support. So it means that they're getting less from the two funding floors that are payable to shire district councils. In cash terms, it's not huge, but it's obviously very important to fire authorities. As now an improved fire funding floor, it's now real terms based on GDP deflator after a 3.8% cash terms increase in overall cost spending power. So that's better for fire authorities overall. Council tax thresholds unchanged, apart from for police and crime commissioners, £3.50 extra. As far as I can tell, no change for the six, for whom a £150 increase in Band D has been built into their assumed council tax income when calculating their funding floor payments. So they're the six there. mostly in London, but also Windsor and Maidenhead. And then additional EFS thresholds announced for these authorities. So these are thresholds in addition to the national thresholds for these authorities. Homelessness, rough sleeping and domestic abuse grant, additional funding announced over the next 3 years, of which 90 million in 26-27. There's something odd is going on with the allocations for this grant. I spoke to a couple of Kent districts yesterday who are getting less in the final settlement than the provisional settlement, despite getting adjustment support grant, and that's because their homelessness funding has dropped between the provisional and the settlement. That's 185,000 for Thanet, so it's a big sum, and it's not clear why. I think we further investigations needed, and I think the department's checking what's going on there. So keep an eye out for possible amendments to that grant. I understand as well that the consolidated grant schedule that was issued yesterday, some of those numbers don't tie up with the core spending power. I've not seen that schedule yet. It wasn't on the website when I looked yesterday, but clearly we do need to check and see what's going on. So just be aware that some of those numbers in the core spending power tables, they don't tie up with the other schedule that's been sent out, and we'll keep an eye on that. I'll let you know if anything additional is released. But that needs to obviously happen really quickly because councils are setting budgets now. Remoteness, I won't cover that. So it's just there's a placeholder, no change. Government not going back on that. Second homes, tax-based projections, again, government not going back on that. A bit surprised at this. I think if the other issues hadn't been around recovery grant and around the baseline roll-ins, this might have been a bigger issue. But I think it's not. It's probably a second order issue, and there hasn't been as much pressure on this. So government's not shifted. Although I do think they've made an error. I think it's incorrect the way they've actually done the projections. And then probably the biggest issue certainly the biggest issue in terms of cash in the final settlement is the additional funding for SEND, affecting authorities obviously with education responsibilities, a major increase in funding. And I think this should result in a significant improvement in local authority financial sustainability. This high needs stability grant, covering 90% of qualifying DSG deficits, funded by the DFE. I think I had a question about where it's come from. I assume it's just been funded by the Treasury or from funding that DFE already had. I don't know. It's not coming from out the settlement or from other funds as far as I can see. I think it's new money to local government. So payments are based on your actual expenditure per section 251 accounts RO. It almost felt like DFE's thinking we don't quite trust you if you're going to self-report, so we'll sort of triangulate with different sources. But it's definitely better than expected. I think we had only been expecting 80% to be funded, so 90% is definitely better. And this follows, I think, some really quite intense pressure from local government for this additional funding, and it could generate, certainly over 2 billion, possibly close to 3 billion pounds. Some of the forecasts are that the deficits will be over 3 billion by 2029. So, the funding could easily exceed, well, it will exceed 2 billion pounds a year, and it could be close to 3. So it's a huge amount of money. The business rate retention system. Interestingly, no business rate pools in 26-27. There were 11 that were kind of proposed and were still viable in the provisional, but I think we weren't entirely. It's not entirely a surprise. I know the pools I've been speaking to weren't going ahead, and I can see why. Hold on until you know exactly what the numbers look like in 27-28. We understand there'll be no allocation from the levy account in respect to 25-26, so no allocation, and we understand the surplus will be carried forward to fund the enhanced safety net in 26-27. So we know it's a more generous safety net. It's 100% of baseline funding level in 26-27, and I suppose that's cautious. They need to make sure that they don't over allocate any surplus from that levy account. So holding back until you know what that safety net looks like is probably a good idea. No change in any of the baselines in the system. That includes business rate baseline, BFL, and of course into the top-ups and tariffs. So it's as you were from the provisional. Then last slide for me, just letting you know we are updating the MTFP model. I've already got all the final settlement numbers in there. Just checking those to make sure they're all carried in there correctly. And just made a few adjustments to the model for the NNDR1. I apologise, but I can't make it work entirely for the NNDR1 yet. I'll update it properly when the NNDR1s are published on the 18th of February, so that's next week. I've made some small amendments to the model so that you can put in some of the new numbers. The important things are, though, that the business rate income, including Section 31 grant that you recognise in your NNDR1, should equal cell L44 in the MTFP tab. So basically, the non-domestic rated income, including Section 31 grants, see there here for Harborough, the 31.5 million. I know that's not your figure, but just as an illustration, that's the figure that needs to agree with your NNDR1, your share of business rate income in NNDR1. So that needs to match up. And you may have to make some adjustments within the BRS tab to achieve this. I know there's some changes I need to make in that tab to reflect the numbers as they now come out of the NNDR1, particularly on the treatment of high value multiplier income and RHL multipliers. And you can see on the right there, you can split your gross rates between changes in the rating list, which will drive your adjusted business rate baseline to create the new adjustment to the baseline for the next financial year. Then the additional income from high value multipliers and RHL multipliers, and then any growth in gross rates that you're expecting after the 1st of April. And I think even for an interim measure, if you do split your gross rates along those lines and then make sure that the business rate income that comes through is correct on the MTFP tab, that should work for now. But I will make sure that that MTFP model is updated for the NNDR1s when they're published next week. Okay, Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. So some of what I'll say will sort of be a bit repetitive of what Adrian said, but I just want to analyse it by authority types and different types, different groupings in terms of the changes to the final settlement. So if we move on a couple of things to say at the start is that Adrian's already mentioned the baselines, the reset associated with the business rate gains, so sort of reset 25-26. So the changes are a little bit affected by that. So districts look like they've gone up because of the adjustment, but they haven't really, because the baseline, they've had some of the business rate gains taken out of their baseline. So it's a bit strange. And then also, if you're looking at CSP per head figures, they've massively changed because of the population changes. So you'll know that in the provisional settlements, we've eventually found that they'd used population projections from 2018. They've now updated those to the 2022 projections, but there's been quite a big shift in population between those projections, and therefore the CSP per head figures will have changed quite significantly. So I mean, Manchester did quite well from the changes. Look like their CSP per head's gone down quite a bit. It's not. It's just there's 44,000 more people in Manchester in the projections than there were with the incorrect projections from 2018. So just looking at this is the changing core spending power for the 1 year, the provisional, and if you move on one, it's the same graph, but it hasn't really changed a lot. It's unprecedented amount of changes, isn't it? But actually, on a CSP of 75+ billion, 200 or 300 million doesn't make a big move. But where it has shifted is quite important. So the recovery grant uplift, 115 million in 26-27, has shifted mainly to Mets and unitaries, mainly in the north. Extra homelessness is a little bit more dispersed across everybody else. And the adjustment grant has gone mainly to districts, and that's the district amount has come up. But it's met with an equal reduction in terms of the baseline, in terms of removing business rate gains, pooling gains rather, from those districts. So it's really compensated the districts for what they've lost. It's not really an increase. If we move on, we should look at the makeup of that if we move on. So in terms of council tax, so council tax, no surprise there, exactly the same. Nothing's changed on council tax in the final settlement. Most authorities should go up by 5% at upper tier and 3% or £5 for districts, although I'm hearing lots and lots of, well, people have said this morning, quite a few authorities, including upper tier authorities, partly perhaps because of the generosity of the DSG grant, might not be putting their council tax up to the full this year. So it'll be really interesting when the council tax figures come out to see what happens there. But in terms of change of government funding, no surprise, no real change, well, no massive changes from the provisional, but Outer London really well because of the changes to the RNFs that included the IMD 25. The Mets have done better than they did at provisional because of the uplift in revenue in the recovery grant. Everyone else is largely unchanged. There's been a bit of a move between counties and districts, mainly for the business rates gain, but otherwise unchanged. So if you move on Adrian. This is the 3-year change in the provisional. And again, if you look at the moving on another slide, you won't see much of a change in the 3 years, other than the Mets have done, and some of the unitaries, some of the more urban unitaries, have done really well from the recovery grant uplift, which persists and increases through the 3-year period. That's the only real change. The support grant for mainly districts disappears after 1 year, and unless that's reinstated, districts then will lose out, which I think the next slide shows. Yeah, so if you look at the government funding over the 3 years, the district's level of funding reduces as that adjustment support grant finishes after 26-27, and then the districts bear the full brunt of the changes to the baselines associated with the pooling gains. In London, like at the provisional settlement, just does really badly. If we move on, one should be a table, I think. So just reconciled the provisional the core spending power table to the final one. You got that, Adrian's already pointed out, the City of London didn't have year 2 and year 3 amounts in the provisional. They now have, so that accounts for some of the changes. But the rest of them have been, the change between provisional and final is set there according to whether you're GLA or combined authority or each type of councils. And then below the line there, you've got where the money's gone really. So it's mainly in year 1, adjustment support grant, recovery grant, and the extra homelessness monies. And then it's just the recovery grant uplift and the extra homelessness monies for years 2 and year 3. We start to look now at where that extra cash has gone. If you move on to the next slide, Adrian. So this is just the change in cash between the provisional settlement and the final settlement. So what you can see there is most of the extra cash has gone to the Mets. Quite a few northern, more urban unitaries have also received cash, and that persists through the 3 years because recovery grant ratchets up. It's 115, then 150, then 175. The districts do not so bad in year 1 because they get the compensation for the loss of the rates, but when that spills out, they lose out significantly. But what I found interesting is the counties that gain from the change in baseline, that gain starts to dribble away over the 3 years. And I guess that's because as everyone moves towards their fairer allocation, counties tend to lose. So not that great for the counties, although a good boost to the baseline and a fair share of the business rates gains. So that's by type of authority. And if we move on one, this is I did this at the provisional, but it shows from 24-25 being the baseline. So you've got the first year, the Jim McMahon year, 1 year settlement in which recovery grant was added, and you can see the red line and the Mets there in the first year boosting up higher than everybody else. And then in the 3 year period from 26, 27, 27, 28, 29, you see Outer London overtaking as the generosity of this 3 year settlement was greater at Outer London than it was at the Mets. But the Met line has pushed a little bit closer because they've got a lot more of the recovery grants in this final settlement. And you can see at the districts there's like a boost to 26, 27, but that's the adjustment grant. And then when that falls away, district funding crashes. I'm from districts. I always have a bit of sympathy for districts, but I suppose it's slightly limited in that when I was working in districts, we didn't anticipate getting any business rates growth whatsoever. So the fact that we've got some in the baseline and quite a bit for some authorities like Harborough, Clive, and North West Leicestershire, I guess that is a bit of a windfall, even though that's now been pared back by these changes. If we move on I think we get on to regions next. You can see there that the Northwest is that second green line, the Northeast being the first. The Northwest done really well. And I think there was a report, wasn't it, Adrian, in one of the papers about a bunch of Mersey, Manchester-based Labour MPs talking about possible rebellion. Well, I think the recovery grants probably sort that out. And the Northwest does persistently well from the extra cash. And that raises the Met's line closer to the outer London. But you can see other areas there not doing so well. East Midlands really crashing, but I suspect that is, Clive, because authorities like Harborough, just seen your meeting chat, Harborough and North West Leicestershire have lost out quite significantly from these latest changes. So East Midlands and East of England, well, I think there is quite a bit of business rates growth, not doing well over the 3-year period, but the Northwest doing a lot better. So it feels a little bit like a political move to make sure that everyone's on side. But if we move on to the next one, you'll see there that actually Outer London has done really well from this 3-year settlement. Inner London really badly. No surprise that the South and the East of England have not done well at all. And then the North didn't do quite as well as we all thought, and that's because of the Mets. They've been lifted up a little bit by this recovery grant uplift, but still way behind Outer London as a region. We move on. I think we will get to, this is a bit of a shocker. So in terms of the cash change, again, it's pretty much gone to urban authorities. There was quite a strong rural lobby. Remoteness got removed. RSDG got removed 2 years ago. Quite a bit of discontent there. Quite an unfairness, if you ask me. But actually, they've doubled down on recovery grants, so they've uplifted it further. Let's remember, recovery grant is a flawed process. One might argue because it uses 2019 IMD data. It was only ever a one-off grant, and not only did it come back, better flaws in the provisional, and now it's gone uplift. So the government is really doubling down on supporting particularly those northern Mets and unitaries by throwing a lot of the extra money there. They didn't need to do that. Wasn't one of the errors, but they did. So it really shows a commitment there, but really at the detriment to pretty much all rural authorities. And if we go on to the next slide, you'll see that slide, particularly on the right in terms of government funding. I mean, if you're from a rural authority, and that includes districts and upper tiers, you will barely see any additional government funding, which for social care authorities that include those with social care responsibilities is a bit of a shocker, really. And you can see a massive divergence between what urban and rural are getting. And that is primarily, first of all, because of the removal of RSDG, DG, and then on top of that, the removal of remoteness. So rural clearly isn't a priority, or rather, I should say, the urban north particularly and outer London has clearly been a priority of this government, and that's just a political choice, isn't it? So if we move on, so has it achieved its aim? Do we have fair funding? Well, I'm going to sort of present an argument that actually, if you just look, I think Adrian's talked about it a lot. We've talked about it a lot. The process has been shocking in parts, hasn't it? The lack of exemplifications in the first place, the lack of detailed information to get right behind the figures, with more perverse explanatory notes in their place, has been really poor. But the outcome, I'm going to make a case. You might not agree with me. The outcome does appear fair if you accept that IMD 25 is a good proxy for fairness and for needs. So if we move on, so look, this is just the additional cash, and you'll see there that again, like those other examples of rural of types of authority in regions, most of the cash has gone to more deprived areas. That's not a big surprise because it's gone to the Northern Mets and unitaries through the recovery grant uplift. But you can see it's doubled down on their determination to put more money in, or at least more government money into the more deprived areas. If we move on one, we'll start to see what that's done. That again, that shows you over the 5-year span that this government will have redistributed from less deprived areas to more deprived areas, particularly in terms of government funding, and actually sufficient magnitude of government funding to even take account of the higher tax bases in less deprived areas. Core spending power has also moved into more deprived areas. If we move on one, Adrian, please. So this just looks at the additional funding, and what this graph shows, it's up a tier. I'll do districts in a minute. It's colour coded according to the type of authority. So the blue authorities are London, reds are Mets, yellows unitaries. The green that you can't see on there at all are the counties. This is where the additional money's gone. And on the leftmost side are the most deprived authorities according to IMD 25, and on the rightmost side, the least deprived authorities. So you've got Blackpool with a big increase there per head, which is that yellow bar on the left. And you won't see Wokingham because it hasn't had any increase, but it's somewhere there on the right. It might be a tiny little increase. So the extra money is clearly gone to the more deprived areas. But interestingly enough, not to all deprived areas. So there's some gaps in there. Not all authorities receive the uplift. There's some ceilings and floors in the uplift, I know, and not all authorities receive recovery grant where there might be more deprived or big levels of recovery grant. So again, that shows that there isn't necessarily a correlation between deprivation and recovery grant, for instance. So it's a strange one, is that, but that's where the extra money's gone. And what's that done? If we move on to the next graph, so this is core spending power, again ranked from the most deprived on the left to the least deprived on the right, and it shows the provisional settlement in 28-29 and the final settlement. And I'm by no means a statistician, but I do know the R squared is the degree of correlation that a set of data has with a best fit line. And you can see there that in the provisional settlement, the R squared was 72%. So that by 28-29, the provisional settlement, the government had moved a lot of authorities from an outlier position closer to that line of best fit. If you looked at it in 25-26, it was about 60 or 50 or 60%. But if you look at the final settlement, they've done it even more. So it's almost like they've topped up those authorities that lost out against where you'd expect them to be on IMD. So the core spending power per head is even more correlated now to a line of best fit with these changes. So therein is an argument that it's fairer. And if we move on one slide, we'll see it for spending power. You can see the government funded spending power, so government funding, it's even better correlation. So if I'd shown you this in 25-26, which we did have the provisional, there were a lot of, particularly in the London authorities, that were way above that line of best fit. Well, they all got fairly beaten in the settlement, provisional and final, didn't they? So they've come back down, and a number of authorities, mainly out of London, that were well below that line, have been pushed up. So it's not a perfect line, but it's not far off it now. So the correlation between IMD and government funding has improved significantly. Now that is an argument that's fairer. To buy into that argument, there's a couple of things you've got to accept. So you've got to accept that the IMD 25 is a fair proxy for needs. Not everybody does. The old civil servants didn't. They wouldn't touch the IMD. You've also, from a rural perspective, got to dismiss, as the government has, that there are any additional costs of serving rural areas. Well, there pretty much is. I think that's been proven. So you would expect that the needs might be on the best fit, but the cost of meeting those needs are higher in certain areas, and that seems to have been dismissed. But if you put that aside for 1 minute, it is a fairer distribution. Statistically, it's a fairer distribution. that upper tier. So if we move on, I think we go into the lower tier. No, sorry, that's the change in government funding. And again, you can see that in order to make that more fair position, they've had to push more money, particularly to Out London's, latterly to the Mets with the recovery grant uplift, and they've had to take a fair bit off Inner London. That's to create that government funding that's now 91% fit to the best fit line. If we move on now, I think we're on to districts. Districts, I think I said this after the provisional settlement, there's no correlation, or there's very little correlation between the least and most deprived districts. Most deprived on the left again, so that's Burnley and Hyndburn on the left, moving all the way to the right, which is Hart and Hampshire and Surrey districts. Very little, and that's because of the confusion of the business rates gains mainly, I think, and the fact that it tends to be universal services that districts provide, so waste that are less correlated to deprivation. But actually you can see again, because they've pared back the business rate gains, there is a better correlation for districts, still not very high one, but better. And if you move on one, Adrian, I think we've got government funding, again, a slightly better correlation. So if you're a more deprived district, you're slightly more likely to do better out of this set of settlements. But as Adrian's already mentioned, there's Hyndburns and Great Yarmouth that really haven't. So it's not a particularly good pattern at all for districts. But that's partly because districts is so wrapped up with the business rates gains that I think it's hard to discern a fairer pattern now. So if we move on one. So do we have a fair funding? Well, they did have a massive task, said this last time, still the case. And they have made massive redistribution. And I think I made the case after the provisional that it is fair if you just look at the outcome, although there'll be lots of authorities that disagree with that, and I'd agree with their disagreement. Rural authorities, less so in London, but they've done really badly from this. But actually, the stats seem to infer that actually, if you were to take IMD, it is fairer. And then my final slide, Adrian, we'll just have a look at some of the things that we sort of put up at the provisional settlement stage. Some big issues. The population projections, they were just wrong, weren't they? 4 years out of date, no one knew what they were. And 4 years on, population has changed significantly. Now, it was only a presentational thing, but they have changed those. They haven't made any comments about it. They've just put the new ones in. So if you see your spending power per head change significantly, that might not be because you've got more or less money. It might be that you've got much more or much less population. So it's worth looking out for that. Business rates, pooling gains, Adrian's already said this. I think they've done what they, the best that they could. It's probably right to, if they're going to leave the gains in the system, which I don't think they should have, but if they are, the pooling gains should have gone more fairly to the counties. They've rectified that, and they've put a 1 year grant into districts so that they don't lose out. It's only a 1 year grant. Districts will start to lose out in 2 or 3 in year 2 or 3. They might want to lobby against that, but we were discussing it before, Adrian. We don't think they'll change it now in year 2 and year 3. All of this could have been avoided if they'd done better exemplifications and socialised some of their thoughts with the sector better, but that's another point. Adrian's already mentioned the council tax second homes error. They haven't corrected for it. In fact, I believe they're saying it's not an error. It is an error. Sorry, it's not an estimation nuance. It's an error. And I think in a quieter year, they might have corrected for this. And actually, because they had the adjustment support grant, they could have slipped a bit of an adjustment in for this, but they didn't. They've doubled down on that error. So if you're an authority, your districts or in a London authority with very high second homes, you could quite possibly have lost out on protection payments because of their error, and they've not rectified it. But the last thing to say, and got to be fair to this government, is I don't think they will quietly fix it next year. Carrie, you don't either, do you, Adrian? But it might be something you want to press on behalf of the authorities that lose out here. I know where I live and where you live, Kerry. South Hams have lost out significantly to this, I believe. And a DSG support, let's end on a positive note, that I think that will eclipse all the other statements in the settlement, because it is really generous. It's much more generous. It's quite a bold move from the government to do that. But for me, because I spend a lot of time with local authority balance sheets, those balance sheets were about to break across the country at upper tier. And I think this will be a huge relief for many. It'll be really interesting, that said, to see how many, having got this massive 90% return of DSG deficits, use some of that to keep their council taxes below the 5%. So I'll be watching closely for that over the next month or so. And that's me done. Thank you very much, Adrian. You're on mute.
I think for the first time ever, we're finished a little bit early. I think Stuart, are you available? Do you want to give a comment? I'm not sure if you can hear me, Stuart.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Stuart. Yeah, great. I just wondered how you think they've done, your successors. I'm
speaking to you from Scotland, which is outside the scope of this exercise. Gosh, what do I think? Well, for those of you I've not met, and the reason Adrian asks for a quick word is I led the work under the previous government, which is the kind of foundation for this exercise. So what do I think overall? So I think at the core of this, there's an exercise that had to be done, as Dan says, and the government deserves credit for doing it. I think the basis of the exercise is a well thought through, coherent and well explained approach to the issues. And of course, you can sit there thinking, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? But that was where we got to in 2018. I think it was the right approach, and the current administration has taken up that approach. So if we ask the question, how have they executed that approach? I think I would have to say, for my taste, that there's a little bit too much kind of almost random intervention, which has at various stages seemed to respond to noise from various quarters. But if you're looking for a kind of clear and coherent explanation for a grant, say, why the grant exists, what it's meant to do, why it is the amount that it is, and why it has the distribution that it has, then the department goes very coy, and the material just isn't there. There's no kind of policy basis for a lot of the things that they've done, and I find that slightly troubling. I'll come back to that a bit later. But it does take us to the recovery grant, doesn't it? I mean, it's there's no clear explanation of what that's meant to do, but let me try and give you one, which is that the whole of the Fair Funding Review was based on an assessment now of relative needs and resources. But ministers had this sense that over the past 10 or 12 years, there was a group of authorities that had done much less well, and that somehow there needed to be some kind of payback for that. There needed to be some recognition that those authorities had suffered disproportionately over that period. But the odd thing was, well, first of all, they didn't really come out and say that in terms. And second of all, if you did want to do that, surely what you should be doing is looking at the state of public services in those areas. Was it poorer than in the areas that had done a bit better? The level of council tax, were those areas charging more than the areas that had done better over that period? You would make some assessment of the impact of those past changes in financing, and then take that into account in the settlement for this year. And that's where they've fallen short, I think. It's the recovery grant was invented, was poorly explained, and has not been justified, and then further money's been put into it in this week, really just reflecting the volume from particular parts of the sector. Now, I know that they've got to win a vote in Parliament. But in terms of a public policy exercise, that's not great. I agree with a lot of what Dan said in his analysis, but I think we're in a different place on the index of multiple deprivation and the role of deprivation. I think what this exercise is all about is working out the demand and the cost of services in different areas. And deprivation is definitely a demand, but it's a driver of costs, but it's not the only one. And so what you have to do is stand back and do a more fundamental exercise. And deprivation has its proper place in that. It has a weighting in that exercise. It's not overweighted. It's not underweighted. It has its correct weighting. And then you put all that together and you look at the outcome, and you will find in that more deprived authorities get more money. But I think it's wrong to start with that assumption and say that we're doing this whole exercise in order to give deprived authorities more money. I think it has to be a consequence of a more fundamental analysis. And therefore, it's not the only lens that you would look through in assessing the outcome. I think the outcome, whether you think it's fair or not, depends on whether you think the adult social care formula is fair, the children's formula is fair, the resources adjustment is fair. I would take a bigger approach on this. I think another policy mistake that they made, which Adrian and Dan touched on, is the reaction to issues that fall within the discretion of authorities. So I always had a very strong rule at the time that the funding approach to funding allocations should not take account of any discretionary decisions by authorities. So the accountability for those decisions was local. The funding system should be neutral to that. And you can see the mess that they've got into by not having that principle in mind. It takes us immediately to the second homes error. That was a discretionary decision by the authorities to charge that. You should be accountable for that to your electorate for doing so, but you should not gain or lose funding on that basis. It takes us to the pooling decision. It was your decision whether to go into a pool or not. Presumably you did so because you thought you would gain. Most authorities did gain, but it was wrong to fold in pooling into the funding system, in my view, and it's look at the mess they got themselves into. So my bigger point in all this for looking forward now is there's just all a bit too much kind of tactical adjustment here and sort of it's almost kind of, in some ways, it's making up things as you go along, isn't it? Predominantly the work that the current administration has done has been continuing things that were done under the previous government, but doing them with more vigor and more energy. And they definitely deserve credit for that. So if you look at restructuring, for example, look at fair funding. But the thing that's missing, and this was actually an issue that was, I think, was very prominent under the previous Labour government, was some sense of the overall strategy for local government, what the role and purpose of local government. And the reason why you need that, I would argue, is that it's what helps you guide all of the decisions that you take. So, for example, just to choose a random example, the Home Secretary is taking a power to sack police chiefs. At the same time, they're abolishing the PCCs and moving that to regional mayors. I mean, shouldn't that be a decision for regional mayors to do? Why is that a Home Secretary decision? So that's actually reversing a piece of significant devolution in the past. I think that's unfortunate. So if we want to get to a system which is more stable, more predictable, where we can start to look at things like fiscal devolution and other very challenging ideas, then we need to have a system that's understood and mediated by central and by local government, and that's sorely missing at the moment. So anyway, that's my current prejudices. Thank you very much.
That's
From
brilliant.
Glasgow.
Thanks, Stuart. Thank you. Thanks, Dan. You're going to say something?
Yeah, I think I remember when I was on the settlement working group, and you were in charge then, Stuart. I'm right in thinking that at the time you guys wouldn't go. You'd acknowledge IMD, but you wouldn't go anywhere near it for the reasons that you've said, that there'd be a bunch of other things that separately considered needs in each of the RNF service block areas, and it is where if you do take the IMD 25 as a proxy, it looks fairer, and it's almost as if, because I know the officials have been saying, look at the cost per head versus that, and you'll see that it's fairer. So it's almost as if they're aiming at that as the eventual aim, isn't it? And yes. I just remember back in the day, IMD kept coming up and was quite strongly dismissed by officials as not like you said, being part of it, but not being the whole raison d'etre for needs.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if we take the foundation formulas, for example, the formulas that fund the greatest number of services, we looked at the distribution of spending on those, and it was clear that the strongest driver of cost and spending in those areas was population. But then if you looked at various other potential drivers, the next most significant, and really the only other significant, was deprivation. So what you challenged then was to set a weighting for population, which would be overwhelming, say 90% or more, and then set a kind of add-on for deprivation. And you would do that to get the best fit with the pattern of expenditure across the country. And so that is what I would argue about deprivation finding its proper place. And the result of that is that the more deprived authorities get more from that formula. But it's not overweighted, but neither is it underweighted.
Yeah.
So you can tell I get slightly annoyed at the sense that the whole purpose of this is to fund deprivation. It's not. The whole purpose is to fund local services, and local services have different drivers. And population, for example, is by far the largest driver, whether it's adults population, children's, general population. But that's not to underweight deprivation, absolutely not. But it's not to sort of pretend that that's an input to the process. It will be an output, and rightly so, but you don't start with that. And I think if you start with that, that's why you end up with a grant like the recovery grant that nobody can really explain.
Yeah, I think as well, Stuart, that I think right at the start of the process, just over a year ago, they seemed to make a decision to pretty much take what you had done for the previous government or governments as the starting point. And I think they should probably have reassessed some of that a bit more. I mean, some of the decisions, for instance, about simplifying, having more per head, getting rid of some of the service formulas. Some of those worked well for more deprived areas, like capital financing, like concessionary fares, and other things like that. And actually, maybe I think the fact they didn't revisit some of those decisions meant that there were some more deprived authorities, some more Met authorities that actually started off a bit lower than they should have done. And I think in the end, using recovery grant was the only way to put that back without going back and digging up some of the original principles. I mean, I don't know what that would have looked like had they done some of those other things, because we'll never know. We didn't get a chance to really discuss or to challenge what those decisions were. But I think that was part of the problem. And I think for those authorities who are getting recovery grant now, that will be the challenge in 3 years' time, because recovery grant will go in 3 years' time, and I think those authorities will need to have a plan for what they ask for in 3 years' time to put some of that back.
Yeah, There's no doubt that the magnitude of the task was enormous, and part of that is because, as we've discussed here previously, the authorities began in a position that was very far from the intended end position, and even with some quite dramatic changes and a lot of extra funding, there are lots of them at the end of the 3-year period that are still not where they need to be, and there's a big problem for the next spending review in a couple of years' time, and the funding review that will have to go along with that. The task wasn't just large, though; it was actually done at a very accelerated pace. The schedule that we had, from I think as early as 2016, through to the consultation in 2018, and the work that we did internally after that point was and the work that we'd intended to do externally, had the government not stalled, was a more considered and relaxed timetable. I think we did 3 consultations even by that point, and we were planning a more open process from that point forward. So the current government has accelerated that dramatically, which is in part why they decided it was easier to take up the reins from where we left them than it was to start fundamentally. It's also true that some of my team members at the time are still in place, and there would be a kind of a sort of unwritten understanding that work was good work, and it was the right place to start. But for me, the key thing that changed was in response to lobbying. Ministers started to think about what had happened over the past 14 years, and whether they needed to recognise that, rather than the exercise that was envisaged at the time, and deliberately so, was a kind of an assessment today of the spending needs over the next 3 years. Ministers decided they needed to do something about the sins of the past. And that's perfectly legitimate thing to do. What I was touching on earlier, though, is I don't think it's been executed in the strongest way in terms of public policy.
No, I think it's very much true. I think the work that you did and your team did, when you were at the department was excellent, and it meant that we could, we had a strong foundation in modelling that, and it really helped, and I think they've really used that as a really firm base, and I agree that they've gone very quickly, and I think at times the wheels have fallen off a little bit. It felt, but we are here, and there are issues with it, but it's to be fair, you did a heck of a lot of work when you're there, and they've really driven it through with a bit of vim and vigor, I suppose, haven't they? Fair enough.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, we did actually complete the work internally, and it was kind of agreed inside the department, but that obviously wasn't public at the time. So we continued working after the 2018 consultation, as you would expect. But for combinations of reasons of Brexit, COVID, and the general state of the government, nothing further was said in public after that, other than we're not planning to do anything about this.
Okay, that's great. Cheers. Thanks, Stuart. Thank you. I mean, I think the question that seems to come up most in the chat is actually the one about the second homes tax base assumption, which I think is widely recognised to have been incorrect. Whether it was done on purpose or not, I don't know, but it's clearly technically incorrect to have done so. And I think Alex Cook saying that the call yesterday, MHCLG saying it doesn't really have any real world effect. And I think that the reality is it does have a real world effect if you're funding, for its funding floors, or it's the adjustment support grant, or it's the uplift for recovery grant, is dependent on those assumptions around the tax base. So it does have a real world effect for quite a lot of authorities. And for some, ironically, it's the inner London boroughs who would gain the most had this been corrected. But there are other isolated authorities, especially some rural ones, South Hams, North Norfolk, for instance, and other parts of the country as well, West London Furness, for instance, for whom it is an issue. It does affect them directly. And I think had there not been, if this has been the one issue, I think they would have corrected it, but they haven't done so. And I think Kevin, you're asking, will they quietly fix that next year? I'm pretty sure they won't. I think it's done. I think that's it. Unfortunately, yeah. Just seeing Peter Hawkins' question about the levy surplus allocations. I heard someone told me yesterday that the department had told them that there won't be any distribution now from the levy surplus account, from the levy account. They're holding on to that surplus in case they need it to fund the more generous safety net payments. I've not seen that officially, but that's what I understand is the case. It's a shame they didn't put that in the final settlement. That's an important piece of information, but yeah, I think, Peter, that there won't be a distribution in respect to 25-26.
Okay, thank you, Adrian.
Yeah.
Adrian, do you think with it being 100% safety net, and with it being the first year following the reval, I reckon lots of authorities will boost their appeals provision, which will send lots of authorities in year one into a safety net position. So it does seem like a wise thing to do. I can't remember what happened in previous revals, but it tends to be, with the uncertainty, you stick your provision up, don't you? And that might throw you into safety net, particularly so soon into the new post reset.
And I think as well, Dan, for those people who are comfortable doing these things, there's no pools this in 26-27. I suspect it'll be the normal number of pools again in 27-28. If you're going to go into a pool in 27-28, you may as well get rid of all you max out your provision as much as possible in 26-27 and get the safety net to pay for it. So I think there will be plenty of authorities doing that, and I think the department's wise to that now, which is why they're being a bit cautious. And actually, to be fair, I think that's probably the right decision. But it would have been good to know in the final settlement on Monday, for sure, one way or another. And as well as you said about the second home's tax-based thing, it's a big issue for UNO. I know it won't affect Cornwall's core spending power of funding, but it is misleading. It is distortive. Just picking up other questions. Yeah, Clive, you mentioned about homelessness. The only part of Harborough settlement that's gone up. I don't think Chris from Thanet here. There is. I think it's got someone come in. Clive. I mean, you were saying there that yours has gone up. I know Chris at Thanet that the Thanet has gone down.
We've been shafted.
But I mean, Chris, it does feel from the response you've got that it looks like there's an issue there that they're trying to get, the department's trying to get the bottom of. Do you think that's true?
Yeah. Possibly. I've heard some things sort of secondhand through housing colleagues that it might be due to a historic issue where we were receiving part of an allocation that was due to be actually allocated to a neighbouring authority. So they may be trying to correct an error there, but to tell us, to get that, it's just the timing. Yeah. The timing's horrific. Yeah. So we're out to consultation on our budget at the moment. A £200,000 reduction is not insignificant for a district council. So the politics around it are horrendous, because I'm now in a position where we're trying to find a way to do the things that the politicians have said they want to do without sort of compromising an already sort of distressed reserves position. So
not good. I mean, hopefully they'll clear that up, and hopefully it's well, I guess if it's a boundary issue, that's what it is, isn't it? They'll just have to rechange but it's the timing that's appalling.
The timing's tough. I mean, they've said they'll get back to us, but I've got my last cabinet meeting for the budget on Monday, and then it goes to full council for it being set the following week. So I can't see that being resolved before the budget's set. So
no, it's tricky, though, isn't it? And someone emailed me just before the start of the webinar saying that I think the consolidated grant allocations came out yesterday. I hadn't seen them. They must have come up by email, so they weren't on the website when I looked yesterday afternoon. And some of those allocations are different from those in the core spending power table. So just need to look at that and find out what's going on. If anyone's got that document, if you send it to me, that would be great. and we'll have a look at that and see what the issues are.
Chris has also mentioned reserves, and that's like a bit of a bugbear of mine, is the officials' sort of fairly casual use and ministers' use of using reserves as a reason for making decisions, when actually they're usually wrong on reserves. They get quite a few things wrong. I think one of the officials has been quoted as being a justification for reducing rural areas that have more reserves. It simply isn't the case. They have less reserves. So I don't know where they get their reserves information from. It certainly isn't from the accounts, which are audited, but it smacks of being a bit sort of lazy using that as justification across the board, when there are lots of authorities really struggling on the reserves. Central government doesn't have reserves, it's cash based, so I guess they struggle with the concept that local authorities have to put aside monies for future shocks.
Dan, if I could just come back on that. I was actually on a call, I think it went out to 151 officers on Monday, just before the settlement landed. We had a call an hour or so before, and Nico did reference that there's a correlation between those authorities that are losing funding and reserve balances. So my response has been that, we're certainly not a good fit to that correlation. I'd like to see our R-squared figure there, because we're not correlated at all.
And I'd like to see the workings completely, because I suspect they're in the same folder, the population projections from 2018 that were erroneously used in the provisional settlement, which is the same folder as that, because there is no correlation unless they're using, flawed RO data, which is sort of 70% erroneous. I think that's what they are. They just don't have a good grasp on reserves.
You think they're that accurate? Use it. You think the RO data is 70%?
Sorry, I've been kind.
If you want good data, go to Dan. Dan's got the data on accounts reserve and balance sheets. Actually, someone's just sent me Jenny's just sent me I should have seen this probably in the local government finance report. It does say, actually, to be fair to the department, that the credit to the levy account was 61 million, which does obviously confirms that there's no distribution from it. Actually, they're putting some money into it. So that is confirmed there. Anything else? Oh, Pete, council tax billing reforms. What is that? The council tax billing reforms. What were we expecting there? I'm not sure.
Is that the 12-month thing rather than 10?
Yeah, I didn't see anything on that. The DFGs and allocations. I think probably that refers to the consolidated grant allocations, and I think they've been sent out. I've not seen them because I think they come out by email. But if anyone's seen those, that'd be useful. Is there anything else, Dan?
I just wanted, those of you who are up a tier, is there any questions around the DSG support then? Because that does seem to be a game changer if it's 90% of accruing and continually accruing deficits. But I know there's some hoops potentially to jump through. Is it as good as it sounds, or are there any sort of nervousness around the detail on the DSG allocations? Anybody got any thoughts on that if you're up a tier? Must be happy.
Yeah.
Well, Jenny.
I think everyone is kind of happy about it, but there are some questions about, is it going to be netted off against any other surpluses? They're kind of using the term high needs deficit interchangeably with DSG deficits. It's only until this March, and we don't know about what kind of proportion of future deficits will be covered. So, I think everyone is cautiously happy, but waiting for more details.
Yeah.
Do you think you'll have to do a lot of work, Jenny, in terms of sending information across, or do you think they'll just take adjustment account balances?
It looks like they're going to be looking at what they've already got, checking off, checking our stories, aren't they?
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Yeah, Alan saying on DSG deficits better than expected for 25-26, but lack of clarity for next 2 years suggests may not be 90% in the future. I wonder. I mean, it's clearly something that they've got other plans, haven't they? So who knows how the funding fits in with their other plans, how much that's going to cost. I mean, Georgia Gould was on the radio this morning trying to explain what they're going to do without actually telling us what they're going to do, because the white paper is imminent. Let's say, so a couple more things here on the consolidated grants. I think Jenny, you sent me the link, and Peter's got it here as well. The link says it's on the settlement table, says it's to the final allocations, but it still takes you to the provisional. Peter Spence, final local authority multi-year allocations for each of the consolidated grants will be published by Friday the 13th of February. So no rush. Everyone's only got budgets to set, so it'd be nice to have that. But I guess some of this stuff, when it wasn't in a consolidated grant, could easily just dribble out over the next 2 or 3 weeks, and we just have to deal with it. We're setting higher standards for them now that it's part of the settlement. But nevertheless, we need it fast. Actually, Nick, is that a comment that you said there? It specifically says it's a local authority responsibility for 26, 27 and 27, 28. Is that basically saying you think that they're not going to fund, or that suggests they're not going to fund anything in the next 2 years?
I think that's how I read it, but I only had a quick skim read, and it's not my speciality, Adrian, on that. Yeah. But that was impressive. It said about using reserves and things to fund it. So
yeah. I wonder if it's just they don't want to commit themselves, don't want anyone to think they've committed themselves, but big extraordinary to fund 90% rather than the expected 80% in 25-26, and then to say actually there's nothing for the next 2 years. It'd be slightly odd, but who knows? Yeah,
because they're still accelerating the deficit. The change in deficit's getting higher each year. So they'll have sorted the current position, but only for it to start again up until the nationalisation in a couple of years' time.
Yeah, Jenny.
Oh, just to say that I have read the stuff, and I would not say that it looks like local authorities are having to cover the deficits for 26, 27, 27, 28. It looks like you will have those 2 years to manage the 10% that remains from up until 25, 26.
Right.
And then the other 2 years will be dealt with later.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks for that, Jenny. Thank you. Great. So should we draw a line under it there? I think we can. Oh, is there any one last thing? Alan saying guidance just for the details were provided, but I think we're taking that with Jenny's. Yeah, fantastic. Lovely. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for all your contributions. We're almost there, I suppose. The line, we're not quite there. We're still waiting for the consolidated grants and other bits and pieces, but we're largely there. It's been a heck of a ride the last 12, 15 months, but we've managed it. Good luck with your budget setting over the next few weeks. Hope it all goes well. And our MTFP model will get the updated version on the website very, very shortly. But otherwise, we'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Cheers, Dan. Thanks, Stuart, as well. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye now. Bye-bye.
Thanks, gents.
Bye-bye.